There are moments in history that seem to belong more to legend than to reality. Stories so unbelievable that if they weren't supported by eyewitnesses and scientific evidence, they would sound like pure fiction. Imagine waking before sunrise in one of the most remote places on Earth. The forests stretch endlessly in every direction. Birds sing. Rivers flow quietly through the Siberian wilderness. The world feels untouched, timeless. Then, without warning, the sky tears open. A brilliant fireball races across the heavens, brighter than the sun itself. The ground begins to tremble. A deafening roar rolls across the landscape. Seconds later, a colossal blast rips through the forest with unimaginable force. Trees snap like matchsticks. Shockwaves race through the air faster than sound. People are thrown off their feet nearly 40 miles away. Windows shatter in distant towns. The heat is so intense that witnesses later described feeling as though their clothes might catch fire. And then, silence. No invading army, no volcano, no earthquake, no mushroom cloud. Just a forest, forever changed. This wasn't the plot of a science fiction novel. It really happened. On the morning of June 30th, 1908, near the Podkamenaya Tunguska River in central Siberia, Earth experienced one of the most powerful explosions ever witnessed in recorded history. Yet more than a century later, one haunting question remains. What actually exploded over Tunguska? To understand why this mystery still fascinates scientists, historians, and dreamers alike, we must first travel back to a world that looked very different from our own. In 1908, the 20th century was still in its infancy. Airplanes were experimental machines. Radio communication was only beginning to connect distant places. Large regions of Siberia remained almost completely isolated from the outside world. The Tunguska region was one of them. Covered by dense taiga forests and home to the indigenous Evenki people, it was so remote that reaching it required weeks of travel by river, horseback, and foot. Perhaps that isolation is one reason why the greatest explosion of the modern era remained hidden from science for so long. The first people to witness the event weren't scientists. They were hunters, reindeer herders, traders, and villagers scattered across the wilderness. Their accounts, collected years later, sound astonishingly consistent despite the distances separating them. One witness recalled seeing the northern sky split open with a blinding column of blue-white fire. Another described a giant flaming object streaking across the sky before everything erupted in an explosion so violent that the ground seemed to leap beneath his feet. Several people believed the end of the world had arrived. One man remembered being lifted from his chair by the force of the blast. Others reported hearing thunder that continued for hours, echoing across the endless Siberian landscape. The explosion was so powerful that people hundreds of kilometers away felt it. But perhaps even more astonishing were the effects far beyond Siberia. Across Europe, something extraordinary began to happen. For several nights after the explosion, skies glowed with an eerie silver light. In London, people reportedly read newspapers outdoors near midnight without artificial lamps. Photographers captured unusually bright night skies. Scientists across Europe noticed strange atmospheric conditions, unlike anything they had previously observed. No one understood the connection. At first, many didn't even know an explosion had occurred. Meanwhile, deep inside the Siberian forest, an area covering more than 2,000 square kilometers had been transformed into a landscape of devastation. When researchers would eventually arrive years later, they would discover nearly 80 million trees lying flat on the ground. Not burned beyond recognition, not uprooted by a tornado, but flattened outward in a gigantic radial pattern, as though an invisible hand had pressed the forest into the earth. Yet, strangely, At the very center of this destruction, many trees remained standing. They were stripped bare of branches, blackened and scorched, resembling enormous wooden telegraph poles reaching toward the sky. This wasn't the pattern left by an ordinary explosion. It suggested something far stranger. Something had exploded above the forest, high in the atmosphere, powerful enough to flatten millions of trees. But not powerful enough to leave the one thing every explosion of this size should have created: a crater. And that single missing detail would transform Tunguska from a natural disaster into one of history's greatest unsolved mysteries. If an asteroid struck the Earth, where was the hole? If a comet exploded, where were the fragments? If something crashed from space, why did it seemingly vanish without leaving a trace? Those questions would puzzle generations of scientists. Some would search for ordinary answers. Others would propose ideas so extraordinary that they sounded like the pages of a science fiction novel. Alien spacecraft, miniature black holes, antimatter, secret experiments. Could any of them be true? Or was the real answer hidden in the silent forests of Siberia, waiting patiently for someone willing to look a little closer? The journey to uncover the truth was only just beginning. And it would take nearly 20 years before the first scientific expedition finally reached the heart of the devastation, only to discover that the mystery was even stranger than anyone had imagined. For nearly 2 decades after the explosion, the Siberian wilderness kept its secret. The forest slowly reclaimed the scars left behind. Fallen trees decayed beneath snow and rain. Wildlife returned. Seasons came and went. It was as if nature herself had decided to erase every clue. Meanwhile, the rest of the world was consumed by events that reshaped history. The First World War erupted. Empires collapsed. The Russian Revolution transformed an entire nation. Scientific curiosity about the strange explosion in distant Siberia was pushed aside by the overwhelming demands of survival and conflict. But mysteries have a remarkable way of refusing to disappear. One man, however, could not let it go. His name was Leonid Kulik, a Russian mineralogist with an obsession for meteorites. To Kulik, the reports from Tunguska hinted at something extraordinary. If a giant meteorite had struck Earth, it could contain valuable scientific information, and perhaps even rare metals. So, in 1927, nearly 19 years after the explosion, Kulik organized the first major scientific expedition into the remote Siberian wilderness. The journey itself was an expedition worthy of legend. There were no highways, no airports, no GPS. The team crossed rivers by boat, rode horses through endless forests, and trekked for weeks across frozen marshes and mosquito-filled swamps. Every kilometer brought them deeper into one of the most isolated places on Earth. Then, they saw it. At first, there was silence. Then, disbelief. As far as the eye could see, millions of trees lay scattered across the landscape. Not randomly, not in chaotic piles, but arranged in an enormous radial pattern, as though a gigantic invisible force had burst outward from a single point high above the forest. It looked less like the aftermath of an impact, and more like the fingerprint of an explosion suspended in the sky. Kulik expected to find a massive crater. Instead, there was nothing. No enormous hole, no giant rock, no obvious impact site. Just endless devastation. He searched marshes. He examined unusual ponds. He dug into the soil. Every promising location ended in disappointment. The crater simply didn't exist. The deeper he investigated, the stranger the mystery became. Then came another astonishing discovery. Near the center of the blast zone stood hundreds of trees that had somehow survived. But survival came at a terrible cost. Their branches had been ripped away, Their bark had been scorched. Their trunks stood stripped and blackened, reaching toward the sky like lifeless pillars. To Kulik, they resembled an army of telephone poles frozen in time. This detail fascinated scientists. If something had slammed directly into the ground, these trees should have been flattened, along with everything else. Instead, they remained standing. It suggested that the explosion occurred several kilometers above the Earth, powerful enough to blast outward in every direction, but never actually striking the ground. It was a revolutionary idea. But if that were true, what exploded? And where had it gone? Over the following decades, scientists proposed theory after theory. The first, and perhaps the most widely accepted, was surprisingly simple. An asteroid. According to this explanation, a rocky asteroid, perhaps 50 to 60 meters across, entered Earth's atmosphere at incredible speed. Imagine a mountain-sized rock traveling faster than 60,000 kilometers per hour. As it plunged into the atmosphere, the immense pressure compressed the air in front of it. The air became hotter and hotter. Eventually, both the asteroid and the surrounding atmosphere reached temperatures so extreme that the object exploded before ever touching the ground. This phenomenon is known as an airburst. Think of it like squeezing air inside a bicycle pump. The harder you compress it, the hotter it becomes. Now imagine that process happening on a colossal scale. The result would be an explosion with energy many times greater than the largest conventional bombs ever built. It was an elegant explanation, but not everyone was convinced, because one question still lingered. If an asteroid exploded, where were the fragments? Researchers searched tirelessly. Tiny microscopic particles containing nickel and iron, materials often found in meteorites, were eventually discovered in soil samples. But there were no enormous chunks of space rock. No massive impact debris. Nothing that seemed large enough to explain an explosion capable of flattening nearly 80 million trees. Then another theory emerged. Perhaps it wasn't an asteroid at all. Perhaps it was a comet. Unlike rocky asteroids, comets are often described as dirty snowballs. They're made of ice, frozen gases, dust, and small rocky fragments. A comet entering Earth's atmosphere might completely vaporize during an airburst, leaving almost no large debris behind. Suddenly, many of the missing pieces seemed to fit. The glowing night skies over Europe, the absence of a crater, the lack of large meteorite fragments. It was an attractive explanation. Yet even this theory had problems. Computer simulation sometimes suggested that a comet might not produce exactly the pattern of destruction found at Tunguska. Scientists continued to debate. Each answer seemed to create new questions. But while researchers searched for natural explanations, others allowed their imaginations to wander far beyond the boundaries of conventional science. Could the truth be something humanity had never encountered before? Over the years, astonishing theories began to capture the public imagination. Some believed an alien spacecraft had exploded while attempting to save Earth from a catastrophic collision. Others imagined a tiny black hole passing straight through our planet. There were even proposals involving antimatter, matter so exotic that, upon touching ordinary matter, it releases unimaginable amounts of energy. To most scientists, these ideas were highly speculative and lacked convincing evidence. Yet they refused to disappear, because Tunguska possessed one quality that fuels extraordinary stories. It never provided a complete answer. And perhaps that is why, more than a century later, the mystery still feels alive. But modern technology would eventually offer researchers a chance to revisit the evidence with fresh eyes. Satellite imagery, computer simulations, chemical analysis, powerful new tools unavailable to Leonid Kulik. Would they finally solve the mystery? Or would they discover that the forests of Siberia were still guarding one final secret? The investigation was about to enter its most fascinating chapter. If you enjoyed this journey through history, please take a moment to like this video, share it with fellow history enthusiasts, and subscribe for more fascinating documentaries exploring the world's greatest civilizations, untold stories, and enduring mysteries. Thank you for watching. Until our next journey through time, stay curious.